Sometimes I think about those times where you meet someone and it just doesn't go well. It's like those encounters, they kind of stick with you. And it's weird because it feels like they almost become these turning points in your life. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, I think everyone has those experiences where things just go south. It is interesting how we tend to kind of fixate on those bad experiences, isn't it? It's almost like we're programmed to remember the pain more than the good times.
Yeah, it's like our brains are trying to protect us.
Yeah.
Like, hey, remember that time someone totally betrayed your trust? Let's try to avoid that at all costs.
Yeah.
But you know what I find really fascinating? It's like trying to decode why someone would act that way in the first place. It's like falling down this rabbit hole of human behavior, trying to figure out why people do the things they do.
It's true. It's like a puzzle.
And I think that's a big part of what we're diving into today. How can we understand these negative experiences in a way that actually helps us grow, especially when it comes to our relationships and how we interact with others?
Right. Because on the one hand, we have this instinct to protect ourselves, to learn from those painful encounters so we don't get hurt again. It's like when you're a kid and you touch a hot snow for the first time. That pain, it teaches you really quickly not to do that again.
Yeah, one burn is enough to make you think twice. So are you saying this applies to social situations as well?
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. The emotional pain of something like betrayal or rejection, that can be just as powerful as physical pain, even though it's not a physical injury. And it often triggers a very primal response in us. Anger, the desire for revenge.
So you're saying that urge to get even is actually a natural instinct. I've definitely felt that before, although I'm not always proud of it.
Oh, it's completely natural. When we feel threatened, our instinct is to neutralize that threat somehow. But what I find really interesting is how that initial anger often shifts over time.
What do you mean by that?
Well, instead of just being angry at the person who wronged us, we often start to grapple with our own lack of understanding.
It's like we shift the blame to ourselves.
In a way, yes. It becomes less about revenge and more about trying to make sense of why people behave the way they do, why they make the choices they make.
It's like we're trying to find order in the chaos of human behavior.
Exactly.
And I think that ties into our deep need for connection. As humans, we crave those relationships where we feel seen and understood.
Absolutely. We are social creatures at our core, and finding those connections, feeling accepted and validated by others, especially those who share our values, that's incredibly rewarding.
And it makes sense why rejection, especially when we've invested a lot in a relationship, why that hurts so much.
It cuts deep because it feels like a betrayal of trust and a blow to our sense of self-worth.
It makes you wonder, even if we somehow become masters of communication and empathy, can we ever truly avoid these negative experiences altogether?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think the reality is that even if we become incredibly skilled at navigating social situations, these negative experiences are bound to happen. They're almost woven into the fabric of human interaction.
So no matter how much we evolve or how much we learn, conflict is just inevitable.
It seems that way.
So then what are some of the most common reasons why these conflicts arise in the first place?
Well, think about it. We live in a world with so many different values, priorities, and beliefs. Clashes are bound to happen. And then there's the whole power dynamic. People vying for status or wealth envy manipulation. It's a complex landscape out there.
It almost sounds like we're still acting out these ancient tribal power struggles.
You're not wrong. That social dominance hierarchy, as it's called, is still very much alive and well today. It might be less overt than it was in the past, but it's definitely still there.
And unfortunately, sometimes we end up getting caught in the crossfire, left to deal with the emotional fallout.
That's true, and it can be a rude awakening, especially if we have this idealistic view of human nature.
Like this belief that everyone is inherently good.
Right. I think it's important to move beyond those simplistic labels of good and bad and embrace a more nuanced perspective.
So how do we do that? How do we move beyond that initial hurt and anger to make sense of these experiences?
Well, I think a good place to start is by trying to understand the circumstances and motivations behind the other person's actions. It doesn't excuse their behavior, of course, but it can offer a more complete picture.
So understanding is key.
It is. It helps us move past resentment and start to turn that pain into something positive.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How do we actually go about transforming those negative experiences into something positive?
Well, I think it starts with a mindset shift. Instead of dwelling in self-pity and seeking sympathy, we need to channel that energy into something constructive.
So it's about using that pain as fuel to propel ourselves forward.
Exactly. And a key part of that is developing what we call social intelligence.
Oh, here we go. I can already tell you're about to drop a powerful analogy on me.
No analogy this time. But think of social intelligence as your sword and shield in the world of human interaction.
Okay, I like that. So you're saying social intelligence helps us spot trouble before it happens?
Yeah. Precisely. It's about understanding the complexities of human nature, both the good and the bad, and using that knowledge to navigate social situations with greater awareness and resilience.
This is starting to make a lot of sense. So social intelligence is the key to turning that pain into power.
Absolutely. But before we dive into the nitty-gritty of how to actually build social intelligence, maybe we should take a quick break to let everything sink in.
Yeah, that sounds good. This is a lot to process. We'll be back in a moment to continue our deep dive into turning those negative experiences into opportunities for growth.
All right, so we were talking about social intelligence being this crucial tool for turning those negative experiences into something positive.
Right, like how do we actually develop that sword and shield you were talking about? What are the key components that make up this social intelligence?
Well, I think one of the most fundamental pieces is self-awareness. Before we can even begin to understand others, we need to understand ourselves.
So it's like looking inward first before we try to decipher everyone else.
Exactly. It's about knowing our own strengths and weaknesses, our triggers, what pushes our buttons. Because without that self-awareness, we're much more susceptible to manipulation or just getting hurt unintentionally.
Right, it's like walking around with blinders on.
Yeah.
You're bound to bump into trouble eventually.
Right.
But how do we actually increase that self-awareness? Are we talking therapy personality tests?
Those can be helpful tools, but I think one of the most powerful and accessible methods is observation.
Wait, just watching people. Like, should I grab a coffee and head to the park and just observe people?
Not necessarily. It's about becoming a keen observer of human behavior, both your own and that of others. Pay attention to body language, tone of voice, facial expressions. Those nonverbal cues often reveal more than words ever could.
So it's like reading between the lines.
Yeah.
Picking up on those subtle hints that might tell a different story than what someone is actually saying.
Precisely. And the more you observe, the more you start to recognize patterns. You begin to pick up on those telltale signs that maybe someone isn't being entirely genuine. Or maybe they're struggling with something they're not voicing.
It's like becoming a detective of human behavior. But is there a risk of becoming too cynical or distrustful if you're constantly analyzing people?
That's a valid concern. It's not about becoming paranoid or suspicious of everyone. It's about cultivating a nuanced understanding of human nature, recognizing that we're all complex creatures with our own motivations and insecurities.
So it's about finding that balance between realism and hopefully maintaining some level of faith in humanity.
Exactly. And as we get better at observing those external cues in others, we also become more attuned to our own internal signals.
You mean like our intuition or gut feelings?
Exactly. Those times when something feels off, even if we can't quite put our finger on why, we often dismiss those feelings as irrational or overthinking, but they're often trying to tell us something important.
Right. It's like that saying, trust your gut, it's usually right. But sometimes those signals can be confusing, especially when our emotions are involved.
That's where the shield aspect of social intelligence comes in. It's about establishing clear boundaries to protect our emotional and mental well-being.
Boundary, you mean like those invisible lines we draw to say,
Yeah.
This is where my comfort zone ends?
Precisely. And these boundaries can be physical, emotional, or even digital. It's about knowing what you're comfortable with, what you're willing to tolerate, and what's absolutely unacceptable.
So it's about being assertive, communicating our needs and expectations to others.
You got it. And sometimes setting boundaries means stepping back from situations or relationships that are no longer serving us, which can be tough, but it's often necessary for our own well-being.
It's like ripping off a Band-Aid. It stings at first, but ultimately it's the healthier choice. But what if asserting those boundaries, especially with people who are used to getting their way, creates conflict?
That's a good point. Not everyone is going to be happy with our boundaries. Some people might push back, try to guilt trip us, or even resort to manipulation. And that's why developing our sword, that ability to stand our ground with confidence and clarity, is so important.
So we need to learn how to say no effectively and not back down when someone tries to test those boundaries.
No.
Are there any specific strategies that can help with that?
Absolutely. One technique is called broken record. It's as simple as calmly repeating your boundary or refusal no matter how much the other person tries to argue.
So it's like having a pre-recorded message in our heads that we just keep playing back.
Precisely. And remember, if a conversation becomes unproductive or toxic, it's okay to disengage. You can always say something like, I'm not willing to discuss this further right now, and walk away.
Wow. That feels empowering, just having those tools in your back pocket to reclaim control of a situation. But what about those times when walking away isn't an option? Like when you have to have a difficult conversation with someone.
Those conversations are never fun, but there are ways to make them more productive. First, choose a good time and place somewhere private where you can both speak openly and honestly. And try to go into the conversation with a calm, open mindset. Focus on trying to understand the other person's perspective, even if you don't agree with it.
It's like creating a safe space for dialogue, even when things get tough.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that you can't control how the other person will react. Even with the best communication skills, you can only control your own behavior.
Right. Ultimately, we're responsible for our own words and actions. It seems like there's a lot of personal responsibility that comes with building social intelligence, but it also feels incredibly empowering. Like we're not just victims of other people's actions. We have choices in how we respond.
That's exactly it. Social intelligence gives us the tools to navigate these complex human dynamics with greater awareness, and ultimately a better chance of creating positive outcomes.
This is really starting to come together now. Building social intelligence, it's a journey, not a destination, right?
You got it. It's a process of continuous learning and self-reflection, and being willing to adapt as we encounter new challenges.
It's about being open to learning from our experiences, both the good and the bad, and becoming more skillful at navigating the world of relationships.
Exactly. And as you continue on that journey, remember, you're not alone. We all stumble, we all make mistakes, but it's through those experiences that we learn and grow.
That's actually really reassuring to hear. Well, this has been incredibly insightful so far. But before we get too philosophical, maybe we should shift gears and talk about some more practical tips and techniques for putting all of this social intelligence into action.
I think that's a great idea. That's exactly where we'll pick up when we come back for the final part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've talked a lot about social intelligence and how to turn those negative experiences into opportunities for growth. But let's get down to brass tacks here. What are some actual techniques we can use in our everyday lives to boost our social intelligence and navigate those tricky social situations?
Well, I think one of the most powerful techniques, and it might sound deceptively simple, is active listening.
Active listening.
Yes, it's about going beyond just hearing the words someone is saying and really truly listening to them, trying to understand their perspective, and responding in a way that shows you're engaged.
So it's not just about nodding along and pretending to pay attention.
Right, it's about being present in the conversation, paying attention to their body language, their tone of voice, the emotions they're conveying, ask clarifying questions to make sure you're understanding them, summarize their points to show you're following along, and validate their feelings even if you don't necessarily agree with their perspective.
It sounds like it takes effort, but I can see how it would make the other person feel heard and respected, which is so important for building trust and connection.
Exactly. And here's the interesting thing. When we actively listen to someone, we often gain valuable insights, not just about them, but about ourselves as well.
Oh, that's cool. So it's like a win-win. You strengthen the relationship, and you learn something about yourself in the process. Now, you mentioned setting boundaries earlier. How do we do that in a way that's assertive but not aggressive? It seems like a fine line to walk.
It is a fine line. I think one key is to be clear and direct in your communication. State your needs and expectations without apology or hesitation. Use I statements to focus on your own experience rather than blaming or accusing the other person.
Oh, I see. So instead of saying you're always late and it's so disrespectful, it would be better to say something like, I feel frustrated when I'm left waiting. I need you to be on time in the future.
Exactly. It's about owning your feelings and communicating them in a way that's both assertive and respectful. And remember, it's okay to say no to requests or demands that you're not comfortable with. You don't need to over-explain or justify yourself.
It's like we have the right to choose what we're willing to participate in,
Yeah.
to protect our time and energy. But what about when someone really tries to push our buttons? Like when they try to manipulate or guilt us into doing something we don't want to do?
That's where that sword comes in handy, that ability to stand your ground with confidence. One effective technique is called the broken record technique.
Broken record.
Yeah, it's basically just calmly repeating your boundary or refusal no matter how much the other person tries to argue or wear you down.
So it's like having this mental script ready, this
Yep.
clear and concise message that you repeat until it sinks in.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to disengage from the conversation if it becomes unproductive or toxic. You can always say something like, I'm not willing to discuss this further right now, and remove yourself from the situation.
It's like taking back control of the situation,
Yeah.
preventing yourself from getting sucked into a negative spiral. But what about those situations where you can't just walk away? Like when you have to have a difficult conversation with someone.
Well, those conversations are never easy. But I think choosing the right time and place can make a big difference. Find a private setting where you can both speak openly and honestly without distractions. And try to go into the conversation with a calm and open mindset. Focus on trying to understand the other person's perspective, even if you don't agree with it.
So it's about creating a safe space for dialogue, for honest and respectful communication, even when the topic is challenging.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that even with the best communication skills, you can't control how the other person will react. You can only control your own words and actions.
That's a good point. Ultimately, we're responsible for our own behavior. Seems like there's a lot of personal responsibility that comes with building social intelligence. But it also feels incredibly empowering. It's like we're not just victims of other people's actions. We have choices in how we respond and protect ourselves.
Absolutely. Social intelligence gives us the tools to navigate those complex human dynamics with greater awareness and intention, and ultimately a better chance of creating positive outcomes.
This has been so eye-opening. It really feels like we've gone on a journey together, exploring how those difficult experiences can actually be turned into opportunities for growth and understanding.
And remember, it's an ongoing process. It's about being open to learning and reflecting on your experiences and constantly refining your approach as you go.
It's not a one-time fix. It's a lifelong journey. And you know what? Maybe those experiences that initially left us feeling hurt or confused, maybe those are the very things that lead us to greater wisdom and connection.
That's a beautiful way to put it. I think that's the most valuable lesson we can take away from all of this. That even in the face of pain and conflict, there's always potential for growth and a deeper understanding of ourselves and the people around us.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that empowering thought. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.